Okay, here we go. Podcast number 5. My guest today is Amit Bhargava. Amit's a really good friend of mine. And Amit, I was at a birthday celebration this weekend in California, and I just realized that I've known you and many others for 70% of our lives. That's pretty scary, right? Either we're old or we've known each other for a long time or both, right?
Probably both.
Probably both. So anyway, so that was, I think, an interesting thing. And with that as an intro, Amit, maybe how have you known each other for that long, and what have you been doing for the last so many years? Maybe you can give a little bit of intro to our listeners about your background, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely. Look, you and I go back a long time to college, engineering college times, which was in the 80s. And since then, I've done a lot, but I'll keep this professional. You don't want you don't want people to know what else I've been doing. But look,
No.
roughly, I started off as an electrical engineer. I was an R&D guy at Motorola for a few years, and then, like many other engineers, saw the bigger picture. Got an MBA. Worked for McKinsey for I think 4 odd years. Those were the go-go times with the dot-com revolution. So I was doing some startups and venture capital around the year 2000. But then after that, got myself a real job, which is what I've been doing. I've been working from a sector perspective, industrial manufacturing, but functionally, my functional expertise is in strategy and M&A roles. So basically, a lot of large U.S. public companies, Danaher, United Technologies, which is now Raytheon Technologies, as you might know, and then Masco Corporation, which is in building products. So until the year 2020, I was working for these large public companies after my consulting career, venture capital, all that. In 2020 was, I'd say, a little bit of a change. I started working for a private equity-backed company called Howden, Howden Group. Howden is a leader in air and gas handling products, and we can talk more about that going forward. But it's basically a leading global provider of air and gas handling solutions that drive enhanced safety, efficiency, environmental sustainability in mission critical processes across a broad range of industrial end markets. So, think about, a power plant. You can't just shut off the power plant. It's mission critical, and that's what
Right.
I belong. And so that's what I was doing until this year, which is 2023. We had a very successful exit. We were acquired by a large U.S. public company, after which, I separated from Howden, and as expected, and looking to my next step. So that's kind of in a nutshell, what I've been doing and where I am today.
So, with respect to Howden, what role did you play? Was it consistent with the functional expertise that you talked about earlier?
Yes, it was actually. So, and I'll talk a little bit about why it's relevant to this conversation as well. So my role was, in fact, I headed up strategy and M&A. If I was to describe that to you a little bit, the strategy part of the role was to lay out a plan. So not me just laying out a plan, but working with the executive team to lay out a plan. That number one, growth, focus on growth in strategically important vertical end markets. And that's, if you think about putting a customer hat on, a market hat on, which vertical end market should we focus on was an important strategic decision. Second, which is relevant here, is aftermarket. So aftermarket initiatives to increase recurring and the recurring and predictable nature of the business. And why is that important? If you think about any company, and particularly those owned by private equity, ultimately we want to exit, be sold, or go public at a high valuation. And the next investors absolutely would value the recurring and predictable nature of cash flows or profits much more than aftermarket was an obvious lever to push here. So the strategy is focused on that. And then, of course, there were, a bunch of operational improvement initiatives to drive cash flow and margin. And then I think maybe one thing that may not be as obvious is creating a very focused narrative about the company. Because if you think about Howden, it's really a company that's playing in mission critical processes. The solutions drive safety, efficiency, environmental sustainability. That's where roughly 65-70% of the business was, but that story wasn't told. Mm-hmm. And again, from an investor perspective, to bring that to the fore, in addition to what we're doing on the growth front, aftermarket, operational improvement front, that is the strategy side of the story. And then, of course, acquisitions, we'll get into that more maybe, but driving strategically driven growth through acquisition, including one of the big strategic levers being aftermarket. So there's the second part of the story here, which we can get into.
Obviously with KPS, you've been familiar with the private equity side also in your past life as well. I mean, so when I was in private equity, when I worked with private equity sponsors in my last company, which I started as well, all of us have a very clear set of deal theses, if you may. Was
Yeah.
aftermarket a very specific deal thesis that KPS had about Howden? And that's how they went about doing this thing? Is that one of the big mandates you had? You mentioned as number two on your list, but was that a specific KPS mandate?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And, when I joined, I was fortunate enough to have discussions with them about, what were the strategic growth levers they were thinking of, what was their thesis and so on and so forth. And look, KPS, fantastic bunch of people. What they saw in the business, candidly, I don't think others had seen. A little bit of a diamond in the rough story. Um, and if I focus on aftermarket, it is absolutely a very important strategic lever. And again, why? It's increasing the aftermarket mix would increase the recurring, predictable nature of the business. Number two, if you think about aftermarket margins for a company like Howden, they're meaningfully higher than new build. New build being selling new equipment and
Yeah.
installing it and so on. They're meaningfully higher. And just to give you a rough idea, at the start, roughly 60% of the business was new build, 40% was aftermarket from a sales perspective. But if you look at profits, it was flipped around. 60% of profits came from aftermarket. So clearly, much higher profitability business. And again, if you think about what the investors look for, margins have been, there's plenty of work that's gone on, which, people have done that shows the higher your margins are, the higher multiples you'll enjoy from a EBITDA margin perspective.
Yep.
So clearly, it's for a PE-owned company, you can drive EBITDA, you can drive growth that way. But then if you can drive up the multiple, you get the double whammy of getting a really blockbuster return. So it was clearly very important to KPS that we focus on that. And then, frankly, if KPS looked at this company and the install base that Howden had was ripe to be mined. It was aftermarket in a sense, and maybe I'm exaggerating, had been a bit of an afterthought. And I think KPS saw this quite correctly and said, wait a second, I mean, you've got this install base, that aftermarket business is yours to be had. It would just take a sustained effort to go get it. So that was another reason why this was an important lever.
You mentioned rough estimates of 60-40 revenue, 40-60 profits. That was before, right? That was when you started, when KPS bought the company. When you guys exited to this public company, what was that ratio? Was it similar, or did you shift it more towards the aftermarket side, and therefore did the profit contribution go up even more than 60-40 on the
Yeah,
aftermarket?
look, absolutely. So we did shift to the right now. It's been a few months, and it's amazing
Yeah,
what
it's, uh,
a few months will do to my memory. But we did shift to the right, and I could probably quantify it if I was to look it up. Um, but if you look at overall margins for the company, there was a meaningful improvement in EBITDA margins, and aftermarket was one of the big levers that drove it.
Perfect. You mentioned a couple of things. You talked about it as an afterthought. You
Mm-hmm.
talked about KPS recognize the right to mine the install base, but that doesn't happen by accident. So your CEO made a decision, not just to bring you in, but fundamentally make an investment in the aftermarket business. How did that investment manifest itself, both in terms of people, process, technology, and candidly, if I look at the track record of what you did and the M&A front, there's a story out there too. So maybe you can just help us understand, what is that transformation that you guys embarked upon, what happened, and that'll be a really interesting part of the story, I think.
Yeah, now look, I think it's a fantastic question, Vivek, because in theory, one could look at the numbers and say, look, aftermarket is more profitable, more predictable. But to actually make it happen and make it happen in a company that was where Howden was 3 or 4 years ago, to make it a priority, I think leadership has a lot to do with it. So the CEO, Ross Schuster, who came into the business just around when KPS acquired the company, he clearly saw that, that the aftermarket was a huge opportunity. And Ross, by the way, he's had a fantastic career with United Technologies, JCI, and so on and so forth. So he's been around for a while, and he saw that very clearly. And there's a few things that I'd point out the way he led the company through this. One is, this may seem like maybe it's a little bit of a fuzzy lever, but just shining the spotlight on aftermarket. And when the CEO of a company delivers the message around the importance of aftermarket of the company, how much of a priority it is, and so on and so forth, it really sets the tone, and people up and down the organizations sort of start seeing the big picture that that's where the priorities are and what the benefits are. And I think that's really important. If leadership is standing firmly behind these initiatives, it sends a huge message to the organization. Secondly, I think there were specific organizational and systems investments that were made. So, some examples of that, Howden recruited a very experienced person to head up aftermarket. And this was a gentleman who was part of the senior leadership team, reporting to the CEO, one of my peers. And he had extensive experience in aftermarket at big companies such as GE, INEO, and so on, and lots of experience. And he really took aftermarket as a function by itself and drove it hard. A focus team was also put in place to work on core process improvements. So it's one thing to say, look, we'll drive aftermarket, but if you want to drive it in a sustainable way, you have to focus on process. Yep. And, Howden had, a lot of companies have that, we call it policy deployment, something yep. strategy deployment, but it's basically all the roots of this are in the Japanese Hoshin Kanri, the continuous process improvement methodology that Toyota had initiated many years ago, and Dana is a big proponent of this. And so one of the big legs of, there's a handful of core priorities that a company chooses and say, this is what we will drive through, strategy deployment or policy deployment. Mm-hmm. And these will be process improvements. So it's one thing to say, look, quarter after quarter, let's measure how we're doing on aftermarket and how many service agreements do we win, or install base growth, and so on and so forth. But to drive process improvement, it's a very interesting methodology. It takes a separate dedicated effort. And, the kinds of things that came out of that effort and process improvement were, the basics of aftermarket, like driving install base attachment, driving long-term service agreement. Basically, at the time of rebuild sales, a product left. Mm-hmm. Howden, that's the opportunity to try and get some attached to the customer. Using digital technology, I think Howden pioneered a bunch on the monitoring, performance optimization, and integrated that with the aftermarket offerings, mm-hmm. pricing. So if you think about high margin pieces of aftermarket, like spare parts sales, and so on, retrofits, performance upgrades, and then also service and maintenance revenues, these grew as a result of this concerted effort to deploy these processes. Yeah, that's a little bit on the organic side. And, the inorganic side, look, I think we did 7 strategic acquisitions in roughly, I'd say, two and a half years. Each one of them had a aftermarket component as a value realization lever. Our largest deal, which was a company called CPI, was pretty much focused on enhancing just mm-hmm. within all the other ones we acquired. They had an aftermarket component, and these were worldwide, by the way. Right. In the US, UK, continental Europe, one in South Africa as well. So very, very important in terms of contributing to the aftermarket story. So you put both these levers together in a number, well, not these two, but the leadership driving the importance right. of aftermarket, organizational focus, process improvements, M&A, it really made a huge difference.
And what's unique is I remember watching the news on Howden go by every few months, the acquisitions that you would announce, like you said. I distinctly remember it was not just CPI, but there was probably a couple of others that you specifically talked about the aftermarket and the service opportunities, the service-led growth that they were doing, which I think was unique in that respect, where you put your money where your mouth was, right? I think that's really the main important message out there. I have to believe, though, by the way, because I've, in addition to being friends for a long time, we've been both in the industry for a long time. These transformations aren't easy. There must have been some stumbles along the way. There must have been maybe a little bit of hurdles here and there. Were there any particular things that stand out in your mind that you guys faced, and B, that between your the aftermarket leader and Russ and the leadership team, you guys did something to overcome them?
Yeah, look, I think what I just described to you, in terms of how we did it, I mean, it's a little bit theoretical, but when you start putting that to practice, it's not that easy, right? So I'll give you an example. So, we deployed this pricing tool for spare parts pricing. Yeah, one thing that's really important is if your frontline salespeople don't use the tool, then you don't get the benefit, and then you don't even get the data that you need to kind of drive,
Right.
this tool forward. So how do you make frontline salespeople use this? I mean, there's a spectrum of things you could do. Look, you can mandate it, or you could just leave it up to people's discretion, or something in between. And typically, just going one extreme or the other is not good. So I mean, finding that right balance, so there was enough flexibility where it was needed, but at the same time, pricing the pricing tool was being used to kind of
Yeah.
uplift prices in a systemic way. It just took time, and it
Yeah.
takes. If you think about the process, you have to measure these. So I'll give you another example, right? So we were talking about driving long-term service agreements. Every time we have a new build opportunity, getting customers to sort of sign on to something. Well, firstly, you got to offer that to the customer. Then you got to, sort of measure how many did they adopt, why not, and so on and so forth. And measuring it and seeing these KPIs tick up over time. And then when things are not working, figuring out the root cause and then counter-measuring that. It takes a sustained effort. It's not like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, here's a an academic process improvement. Let's just go roll it out. But then you have to figure out what the key metrics are, track them. And by the way, for process improvement, I'll say one thing: it's if you're missing targets, it's okay. I mean, if you're missing targets on your P&L front, that's not okay. Which is
Right.
why the process improvement stuff is separate and different.
Right.
And why is it okay? Is because when you start missing, it's not quite working as it should be. Then it makes you step back and say, wait a second, let's just step back, do a root cause analysis, fix it, make some improvements, and see how that works. Do a Kaizen or do a sustained problem-solving effort, and that's what leads to sustained improvement. So, these things came up in each one of these processes, Vivek. I mean, and the key to solving them was every month, tracking things, stepping back, figuring out the root cause, countermeasuring, improving, continuous improvement, and then you start see how things stick up. So that's
Yeah.
what it's really.
It's actually interesting. You said a couple of things. A few minutes ago, you talked about the CEO's shining spotlight. You and I both studied back in business school, the whole Hawthorne effect, right? You literally turn the lights on and the workers worked harder. You turn the lights down, the workers work harder. The point is people are paying attention to it, right? So that's point
Yeah.
number one. The second point is, in addition to the Hawthorne effect working where somebody's paying attention to it, is the other maxim or the other aphorism that says what gets measured gets done. And I think
Right.
part of the whole policy deployment, KPI tracking, all these things is people are realizing, hey, somebody's paying attention to these metrics. I better work on them, right? And things get done, right? So there's a combination of attention and the metrics or measurements in place to kind of get the people moving in the right direction, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you have to create I don't know what the right term is, but kind of a safe environment to let people focus on these longer term process improvements. Because, look, I mean, businesses have monthly quotas, monthly targets, quarterly targets, and that is not the place to be, messing with process, right? Because the
Right,
minute
right,
something's not working, the right away what people want to do is make it up. So it's not
right,
really countermeasuring. It's like,
right,
hey, I'm missing sales in one region, let me make it up somewhere else.
right,
You're not solving
right.
the fundamental problem.
Yep,
Which is why for the process improvements, you have to separate that out and say, guys, it's okay. You start measuring these metrics. If you miss, if you see red on your KPIs, that's okay, because that's an opportunity to go fix it. And in
yep.
fact, if everything on day one is green, there's something wrong, because we're not really, applying our brains to fixing a process
Right.
that could be improved.
The one of the things I've realized over time and that we're doing now with our customers is putting a framework we call the aftermarket maturity index or aftermarket maturity curve, if you may. And you literally do something as simple as, a scale of 1 to 4, where 1 is basically an afterthought, reactive stuff that just happens on an inbound basis, all the way to nirvana, which is level 4 or 5, which is you got an engine working, you got things automatically happening. You don't have to teach and train people all the time. Would it be? I wouldn't put numbers in your mouth. Where would you think that Howden was when you guys started this journey? Where were you when you guys ended the journey? Your part of the journey and that maturity curve.
That's a look. I mean, I'll give you an answer that won't satisfy you, because also, look, we moved forward substantially.
Yeah,
So it's a loosey goosey answer, but
yeah,
in terms of process maturity, the way we dealt with that was, look, if a process went into our policy deployment, it was clearly, process maturity was quite low, and then for it to exit policy deployment, there were a bunch of gates or hurdles. We had a framework, a systematic framework to say, look, does it tick all these boxes? If it does, only then can it come out. And that's mature enough that we don't have to focus on it, month by month and having, discussions and countermeasuring and so on and so forth. So what I'll say is a bunch of these aftermarket processes and example pricing, that went through that and came out, through sustained effort over a year or 9 months or 18 months or what have you.
Yeah.
So I'm not giving you precise numbers, but I think this point you're making about process maturity is spot on. I mean, we use this framework not just for aftermarket M&A. I mean, the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
The M&A was being done and different phases being done across the organization in different parts of the company, and just to make sure that we were making sure that people are coming along and no one's left behind, that we're making progress, it's getting the process is mature. You have to measure that and sort of use that as input to drive work going forward.
The other part of the process, or you and I've studied this over time as both our experiences, is that there's people, there's process, there's technology. I mean, clearly there's all three have to work in tandem to make all this thing work. You talked about the process, discipline, policy deployments. You know, did the leadership team, and certainly in the aftermarket, were there people reskilling, people upskilling, people replacement? I mean, the hard stuff that needs to get done, was that part of the change management also over time? Or were you able to kind of more or less keep most of the people in place, reskill them, and keep going?
Vivek, I'd say it's not so much, there was some reskilling, but there's also augmenting what we had already. So, for instance, where technology was involved, that was a capability that perhaps Howden didn't have as much, let's say 5 years ago. And so people with those skills were brought in to focus on that side of the story. But if you think about out in a region in the field, they were very competent people driving aftermarket sales and that business. These folks were, there's no need to change them or what have you.
Yeah.
They stayed, but now they had a much more of an enhanced toolkit to go out with. So there was some education to be done as some of these new initiatives were rolled out. But I think parts of the business, the technology side, for instance, I mean, Howden's not a technology company; it's not a software company. So we did have to add that in.
A couple of questions for you then as you went through the journey, and I think you guys announced the sale of the company sometime in like fourth quarter last year, and then it closed sometime in April this past year, a few months ago. There were some certain aspects of which were attractive to the acquirer. Did aftermarket have a role to play in it? Because I know there were some other macro themes that they were focused on as well.
Yeah, look, I think it did because I think that's a capability that is going to be additive to the acquirer. I've not been very close to what they've done after the acquisition because I separated right about then.
Yeah.
But certainly they were, if you think about the strategic rationale, it's quite compelling. The value chain and some of the energy markets and so on. It's a very, very complementary businesses. And my sense was that Howden had a head start in terms of, aftermarket process and aftermarket in general that could be valuable to them going forward. So I would think it did have would have some benefit.
So I'm going to switch the line of questioning away from your last role to a couple of more philosophical questions, if you may, right? So if you think about you've been in corporate environments at Danner, UTC, Masco, you've been around consulting now with private equity sponsor-owned company like Howden. You've obviously clearly recognized the value of the aftermarket or the recurring revenue streams, but you and I both know that this is not such a commonplace occurrence, as in focusing on this strategy. So philosophically, I mean, again, you've been around a couple of years, if you may. Why do people not recognize the value that KPS and Howden did, and what's holding people back?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, if I think about at least my experience, right? I mean, there's 100 things to do. I think companies are busy rolling out products, getting new customers on board, and sometimes it's really tempting to say, look, let's just focus on growth with new opportunities and so on and so forth. But going back to the opportunity that exists in the aftermarket, the install base, for some people, it just doesn't come sort of naturally. And that education has to take place and say, look, wait a second. Yes, you want to grow through new products and rollouts and so on and so forth, but just think about what you have already and what you can drive. And here's 10 different examples of companies that went back and mined that opportunity, frankly, it gave them resiliency. The cash flows, predictable cash flows from aftermarket can go on to invest in R&D into creating new products and then sort of drive the flywheel that way, right? So you have new
Yep.
products and you create a new line of aftermarket some years down the road. I think that education has to take place, and maybe it's because of you talked about organizationally, and this is my conjecture, right? And you asked me, I'm sitting in the seat, why do I think it is? It's a little bit of conjecture that companies don't often focus on both sides of the story. It's really you know new
New product
focusing more
sales.
on the product, the product
Yeah.
sales side of things. That's not a great answer to wait, but that's just kind of
Yeah,
my
no, I think it's
feel.
actually interesting you said that because back in the 90s, when I was at another big industrial conglomerate, we
Uh,
made a concerted effort to get away from the afterthought mentality to forethought, if you may, in terms of aftermarket and service. And it's a huge deal because getting people to change from, as the leadership used to call elephant hunters to squirrel nut gatherers, right, was a big shift. The salespeople thought it was beneath themselves. They never got the right talent in place until you systematically had to make talent changes. So that company made a clear effort to put what they called A players into services, into the aftermarket as a way to kind of fundamentally say, look, this is important. And we're going to put our best people out there, and this is why it's going to be. And they made a big shift, as you know, right? The
yeah,
company we're talking about. It made a huge shift in the business model, and that paid dividends for them for a long time. So
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I think that's part of the story. So you're right; it's a big education process to get things done. But the other part is if you think about it, right? The experience you've had being with a sponsor and the previous experience as well. You clearly know that this has value. Not every single company thinks that way. So if you were to say, look, based on the experience you've had as a sponsor-owned company and past experience, what are the two or three things you would ask a traditional manufacturer who has some incipient aftermarket business or latent aftermarket business they could harvest? What are the couple of items that pieces of advice maybe you could give them?
So let me just step back because I was reflecting a little bit more on your question about why companies don't sort of gravitate towards aftermarket naturally. Look, I think there's probably a tiering in the market, right? There's some companies that absolutely do, and then there's some companies that doesn't make sense, and it's this middle that there's a gap. So what do I mean by that? So if we go back to one of my previous employees, United Technologies, the jet engine aftermarket is pretty much where money is made, right? So
Yep.
it's front and center. That business is managed well, it's driven well. UTC also had elevators. So if we think about
Hmm.
elevator service, I mean, it's a fantastic business, by the way.
Yep.
New build isn't growing that much, but the aftermarket is, it's a fantastic business. So those kinds of companies get it. And why? Because those are certain sectors where it's pretty inherent to the business model. You can't just survive on selling jet engines
Right.
without doing aftermarket. You won't, you go out of business very quickly. So it's kind of obvious there. I
Yep.
think there's the other extreme where, one of the companies that work for Danaher, the aftermarket there was if a product breaks, it's basically, replace it.
Hmm.
So, it's just not worth going out and fixing things. And
Right.
these were, handheld products and the like.
Yep.
So that business model that says, look, you don't really have a need, a crying need
Totally.
for aftermarket. But
Yep.
it's this middle where it's kind of fuzzy, right?
Yep.
Hey, we can only have so many priorities. Where do we focus our attention? And that's where I think there's a little bit of questioning that should happen. Companies do strat planning and the like, and expanding their perspective on what their addressable market is, for instance, right? So you've got the new product sales part of the market, but do you also have an aftermarket opportunity? Take up, what I would suggest is start with the market. Is there a market
Right.
for you? Do you
Right.
have the capabilities to serve it? If not, what are the gaps? Go figure that out. What the gaps are and fill it. I mean, that's part of your aftermarket strategy, and then that drives the strategy.
And I think that's actually interesting what you said because back in the 90s, this conglomerate, the explicit decision wasn't just motherhood and apple pie to go after services, but the leadership they recognized that focusing on the post-sales aftermarket environment of the life cycle of the asset, be it a jet engine or a turbine or CT scan or whatever it might be, locomotive business where I was at, it dramatically expanded the total available market. And
Yeah.
then they realized my share of the total value is actually very small. and I can expand it, and you can go after it. So I think that starting with that perspective, Amit, is actually really important. And I don't think I see most people think about it that way. They think about how many more widgets I can sell, how many more machines I can sell, and what's the total available market for that. And I think if you don't start with that perspective, it kind of doesn't really, then it'll never make the priority list, right? So,
Agreed, and that's why I think it's really important. When I've been doing strat planning for a long time as well. I mean, people come up with aspirational stuff, put it on a shelf,
right,
and nothing happens.
right,
But
right.
if you do it right, you really should start with the market opportunity.
Yep.
And if your share is high, there's certain things you could do to defend the share. If your share is low, like a company who's not being doing aftermarket, heck, then you got to figure out if this is a huge opportunity. Is there something that we can do to go after it? What are the gaps that we need to fill? And that kind of tells you what you should be doing on that front. So it's really important, I think, to when companies do their strat planning every year or every 2 years, whatever they do, just step back and think about the addressable market in a more comprehensive way.
There's something you said in the beginning of the conversation about cash flows, predictability of cash flows, resiliency of cash flows. Would this not be a CFO topic as well? Because if you think of the CFO's perspective, he or she is really trying to ensure that the company is well set from the balance sheet, from the cash flow perspective. After all, these mature companies are valued as a multiple of cash flows, and predictable cash flow is really more valuable than not. I believe that this ought to be a CFO agenda item as well, but I never see that. Right there, I never see that in the context of valuation. That aftermarket is really an important lever that we should focus on.
I don't know, because I think at least at Howden, I mean, CEO was a fantastic guy. He got this right. I mean, he knew this, right? I mean, this was an integral part of the strategy. He completely got it. So again, it might be, Vivek, have companies sort of realize what the opportunity is, and once they do, I think that 99.9% of the CFOs would go, yeah, absolutely, this is fantastic. This is something we need to do.
Yeah.
Because from a financial perspective, it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. When you think about all those experiences you've had, Amit, obviously the sponsors are the ones who tend to be at the forefront of this. What advice would you have for maybe sponsor executive teams as well, right? In addition to this stuff, because you've now been through a private equity owned business. I have a question for you about your next steps, the next role. Are there other, is there advice for PE owned company leaders in this regard? Not necessarily aftermarket, but just, I guess, it's a general question, right?
Yeah, look, I think I don't want to sound cocky or arrogant by any stretch, because the PE firms I work with are fantastic. They're super smart and they see this. But maybe I'll relate to you at least my impression of how our prior owners saw this, because when they looked at this business, they could have, and I saw the materials they looked through, they could have concluded that this company is what it is, and there's not much to be done here, what have you. But I think to sort of go beyond that and say, look, let's just think about this company a little bit differently, and how is there additional value to be created that perhaps the previous owner didn't see? Aftermarket being one of the levers. I think smart sponsors would do that, and they probably do that all the time anyway. To say, look, we can do better than the previous owner. We see sources of value that they didn't, and that's why this makes sense to us.
Great. So, Amit, what next? Now that you've finished your garden leave, finishing a garden leave, what next for your story?
Look, there's something that's coming up that I haven't sort of announced it yet, but for the next year or so, which I'm pretty excited about. Again, a PE owned asset, and then after that we'll see. There's as you can tell, look, I just love this stuff. I love the strategic side of companies, helping them. The M&A side. I think, give you an example of the M&A side. I think I've been doing this a long time, and what we put together at Howden was, and I'm bragging here, I admit, I'm completely bragging. It was completely world-class, right? Yeah. So if there were other sponsor-owned assets, and they say, look, M&A is a major lever in terms of how to set it up, and again, process is really important, and then getting the organization behind it. It's not one person who does it, by the way. We have presidents from across the different business units driving cultivation, as I call it, creating proprietary deal flow. So I think, I don't know if I don't want to do the same thing over again, but helping other companies put that in place, or helping other companies think through about strategy and additional levers, kind of this market-driven approach. I mean, that's something that could be appealing. But for the next year or so, I think I'm very happy with what I'll be doing next. I'm quite excited, and in due course, I'll probably sort of make share some more specifics about that.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about it. And but I think this experience that you just shared with us at the Howden days was amazing. I think there's so many lessons that get learned from what you just shared with us, and it'll be interesting to see how people respond to this podcast in a few weeks when you put it out there. So I really appreciate it, Amit. Thank you so much for taking time today to join the conversation, share some of the nuggets of wisdom, and I truly appreciate it. And good luck with the next part of your journey.
Absolutely. Thanks, Vivek, and hopefully we'll see all of you soon.
Yes, thank you.